Welcome, everyone, to our third meeting of the Rethinking Disability Mathematics book study. Tonight, we're doing chapters 5, 6, and 7. So the UDL, like what is UDL and how do we design with UDL in mind, as well as that first one of this kind of practical investing in core ideas. So I'm excited to get us chatting. I really kind of liked the format we did the last time. In case you weren't here the last time, where we'll go into a small breakout group and I'll give you about 10 minutes to talk about that chapter. Then we'll come out and debrief and be able to share in the big group. And then we'll go back in for the 10 minutes on the second chapter, chapter 6, come back out to debrief for the recording, and then go back into the small for the last time for that chapter 7 and come back out and chat about that and then wrap up. So I kind of like that combination of the small group discussion and then coming back out for the highlights as a whole group. And that's what everyone will get with the recording, people that aren't able to make it. I know all the vacations are happening during the summertime and all. So, all right. So let me get you going into the groups. Are going to be randomized as always. So hang on one second. We're going to talk first about the what is universal design for learning, so chapter 5. If you remember, I have the chapters in the questions, the guide our discussions in the schedule of our meetings. And so this first chapter just talking about, was there anything new to you about UDL and or UDL math? Were there any barriers to learning math that resonated with your experience either as a learner or as a teacher? And how do you help to develop students' self-understandings and their self-regulation skills and their executive functioning skills? So that's the topic for this first chapter. So hang on just one second. Get it down to, there we go. It should be asking you to join in a room. I'll be bopping in and out of the different groups, and we'll come back out in 10 minutes. That's always a good sign when the whole 60 seconds goes by and no one's come out to the main room. You're deep in your discussions. But I have to be mindful of getting all in one evening. I don't want us to be here all night. All righty. Is anyone willing to share from the group about your discussions? What came up in your discussions on chapter 5 of defining what universal design for learning in math is? Any of your experience as a teacher, as a learner, any barriers, those kinds of things?
I would like to nominate Maggie to share what she was getting ready to share because we got caught
up. So we were just talking about like how UDL was kind of new to me. Like I thought I knew what it was, but once reading this, I kind of realized I didn't fully understand UDL. And then we got to number 2. We didn't get to question 3 in our group. We just were talking a lot. But for me, I kind of felt like I was pretty good with the algorithms. Like I remember in 3rd and 4th grade learning my multiplication facts. That like took me a little while, but once I did that, like I tended to be in the, like my math classes were leveled and I was normally in the faster math class. But then I remember like in geometry, like once I got to radicals, it like fell apart. But like for me, I think one of the, like I know it talks about barriers, but for me, like I kind of liked how Ryan earlier on was talking about the things that she realized she needed to do to be successful as a student or as like a mathematician. And for me, like I felt like once I understood the problems, like I would practice more and that helped me. And I would ask a lot of questions. And I remember in high school, my teacher said like she was the queen of the 2-minute lesson, which was not helpful for me because I felt like I needed more time to fully understand it. And then I remember like a student was like walking us through something and she's like, does anyone have any questions? And then she singled me out and was like, Maggie, do you have any questions? Because I always asked questions. And I remember kind of feeling awkward of like, sorry. Like, I always felt bad that I was asking questions, but like that was how I understood. So I kept asking questions. And I think that translates, like as a teacher, I always encourage my students to ask questions, and like questions about the content doesn't bother me because I figure if one student has that question, another student has it, and I really want them to ask. So I constantly encourage them to do that. And then when reading the chapter, I was just thinking about how like sometimes I don't give enough think time, and I think that's a big barrier for students. So that was something that I need to think about more for next year.
Yeah, I love listening to the parts about the empathy interviews and asking the kid, like rather than assuming the kids, oh, this is too hard for them, like actually asking them what was going on. And then their response was, we didn't mind working on it at all. We just wanted more time. It's like, oh, what a brainstorm to ask the kids what they need for their learning. So important. Absolutely. Any other ideas and thoughts on the UDL of math? Was that new to many of you? Have any of you already been kind of implementing that or thinking about that in your planning?
I can share from group one. We talked about how even though we had been exposed to UDL maybe 5 years ago, it has changed so much. And like the definition of it today is very that we were remembering it as a way of backwards planning, and that and looking at it as identifying the barriers so that you can support student success was kind of a new and interesting novel way to look at it.
Yeah, so interesting about doing it at the beginning and not retrofitting after a lesson is done. What can I, like a checklist? What can I do to check this off? Yep, I've done this, this, this. Yeah, very different mindset with that. That line about classrooms disabling students, that hit me hard, right? That there's not the kids, that they don't need to be fixed, but like our classrooms are disabling them from allowing them to be the best mathers that they can be, right? Any other group wanted to share?
I think something that I brought up in our group that was new to me with it was, I find it now. It talked about the 3 networks of the brain, of UDL, and the engagement, representation, and strategic action. And that was just new information for me to read and how they kind of broke it down, identified it. And we talked a little bit about that in our group.
Yeah, absolutely. Representation, I think, is a lot of what I do in my consulting work, right? The concrete, pictorial, and abstract, and those multimodalities of things. I'm adding on now, having read the whole book, I don't remember what chapter it was in, but also adding on the verbal and contextual as 5 representations, the Lesh model of representations. But I meet teachers all the time who will share that they don't have manipulatives out for the kids because they're always just a hot mess. The kids are eating them or they're throwing them around the room. And so literally those representations aren't happening in the classroom to allow the kids to engage in the mathematics. And I just have more validation of like how much more strongly I have to say that I want manipulatives within arm's reach of every child at all times, at all grade levels. It just, yeah, for sure.
Heidi, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just said, like, we didn't talk about it in the group, but I was like, my notes in the book was what I noticed is like sometimes the problem is that the IEP goals for a student are not on grade level. So, so my big question is like, how do you design math learning that is equitable to everybody if their IEP goals are like, in second grade, it could be recognized numbers up to 20. So it's like, it's like where all the peers are way past that point, I would, argue, but then the kids still need to learn that. And it's just, that's just kind of, that part is always hard for me. And I was wondering if the group had any ideas.
I found that interesting, and actually struggled when there weren't math IEP goals, because the supports, the IEP goals, that's where they're supposed to be getting support in a tier 2 setting, and it could be in the classroom or outside. So if those are the goals, you can scaffold in the classroom, but I don't, at least in our districts that I work with, you're not required. That's part of the support that you can get outside of the classroom. But there, we could probably find a whole book on writing better math IEP goals, because that's another piece. But that all ties into, we talked a little bit about where she's talking about prioritizing, which I know comes later in that core chapter, but prioritizing versus pacing, and just the assessment, when the students aren't ready yet. It doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just they're not there yet. And so time, whether it's more time on a given task or assessment or overall time with maybe pick up more the next lesson. I think that's important messaging that I took away from this piece.
I'm looking forward to chapter 15 to hear about those IEP goals. I've read some other work on Rachel Lambert has put out, and she really focuses. So I'm going to go to chapter 15 after we're done here and see if that's what she talks about. But she talks about aligning the IEP goals with standards of mathematical practice and how much more powerful that is. So that I'm really excited to learn more about that and what that looks like.
Yeah.
And there was a student in one of the vignettes she had shared as well, who went up to a board with a paraprofessional to share. And in her mind, it was like the math content is the focus, but instead it was another teacher in the room was like, oh my gosh, he has never gone to share anything before. Like that can be a goal too, right? All those 8 math practices can also be goals. And yeah, so really, really powerful. Yeah. Any other last thoughts on chapter 5?
I think for me, the piece that was most powerful is the idea of this as it says, and it's on page 82, and it says designing UDL math to center mathematics as a human practice. And I love the framing of, we're designers as educators, we're designers. I think it gives power to educators that we can do these hard things that include all kids, even kids that traditionally have been challenging to include. And I was sharing in my group, if you Google STRAMP, STRAMP, there's a really great image that I think is a nice kind of visual to represent when people work together and think about designing something from the ground up to meet the needs of all. It doesn't need to be ugly or an add-on, or it can be really beautiful. And so I think to me, I get a lot of hope reading this and thinking about how if we work collaboratively in instructional teams, that we can truly find and create math classes that meet the needs of all students.
Thank you, TJ. All right, I have put in the chat bar the link to the interactive file. So if you in your groups, one of you wants to go into that interactive file and type up some notes just to record it, I put it up above the one from last meeting so that it'll be a continuous document when we're done of each of our meetings and each of the groups. So just another way for us to capture what each group is talking about, since we don't get to talk about everything that all's happening in your rich discussions. All right, here comes the big art rooms again. Now this is going to be for chapter 6. All right. Any thoughts here on the chapter on the designing with UDL in mind? Any takeaways? Good conversations you were having?
I would be curious, Annalise, what your take is and what you think that Rachel's take would be on CRA.
Well, I know a little further in the book, there's a 5 representations model of concrete, pictorial, abstract, verbal, and contextual, and how all 5 of those need to be for all kids to be able to understand the mathematics and to be engaged with it. So yeah, I think she would say absolutely that those math tools, manipulators are out at all times as a thinking tool to be used whenever a student wants it, but it's not on a bookshelf in the corner, and if you need it, go get it. It's just right there. It's just right out there all the time, being able to reach for and use it, and that we are connecting representations. It's not just living in one modality, it's we're connecting it across representations, showing those connections. So yeah, I definitely think that.
There's a really good protocol from Grace Kalamenic and Amy Lucenta on the Fostering Math Practices that's called Connecting Representations. And Rachel refers to that in that NCTM article that came out before the book.
Wonderful.
And there's some good examples there.
Thank you.
To add to that, I was thinking that it's also really important to not see it. Some people just see it as a linear thing. You know, first you do concrete, then you do representational, then you do abstract. I think it's so interesting when you have kids who are in the abstract world and you ask them to go back to concrete and they really can't. That kind of shows you that conceptually they don't understand or don't have a full understanding yet. So to push that through, it's all of them. I know that my friend who's in here somewhere, I don't see her right now, Laura says, be in the sweet spot in the middle, where you can do all of those things. That really shows understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Christina Tondevald has an image of like a Venn diagram, and in the middle is that sweet spot of those areas. Yeah. I hadn't really thought before, and it's going to be in a future chapter, about the verbal and contextual as well. Contextual, I've always loved in terms of like problem solving, putting everything in context, but I hadn't really thought to say all five all the time. And particularly that verbal, how that will help our students who are dyslexic as well. And having those sentence stems doesn't hurt anybody to help them get started. In fact, I saw a television show that was a whole bunch of neurodiverse young adults interviewing a celebrity actor that I love. But they were all neurodiverse. And there was this young man who could not get the question out of his mouth. Like he had the microphone and he was smiling, and it was really awkward for when you're used to kind of facilitating a discussion. You kind of was like, just get out with it, right? And it took him a good full minute, and he came out with like this unbelievable question. Like I didn't expect that when he was having such a hard time getting started. So I think the idea of having those sentence stems and supports to the kids, what a great tool for everyone to get them started, right? And those for sure.
We had put on our slide about page 99 and the possible questions for the math empathy interviews, because it's always good to have specifics and not just explain what an empathy question is, but have examples. So that was appreciated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
I just popped in the chat because we also talked about in our group, there's a template that I put together based on some of the street data language and something from High Tech High. So if you're interested, I'm happy to share.
Norma, can you put that is it on your slide in the group?
What I have, as long as my group number tells me what group number we were, what group? 7? Okay. Yep.
Okay.
And Lisa, I wanted to ask you, the empathy questions that were just shared on page 99, how do you think Dr. Nikki would feel about asking one of those as far as the math running record? Because I know that there's that part of the record itself that tells you about how they feel about math.
Exactly. That last piece of the running record is the disposition piece. How do they feel about themselves as a mathematician? So we ask them, do you like math? So what is their just affect toward math in general? And then we ask them, what today on the front benchmark expressions, which ones look easy to you and which ones look tricky? Because the research behind that is that the more they have a way to attack like a math fact that they don't know, the less tricky it will look, because they'll have a way of attacking it. It looks tricky when you're like, oh, I don't even know where to start with that one. But we can watch that progress over time as they're like, oh, I can multiply by a 7, which scares all kids, until they realize, oh, I could break it apart into 5 groups and 2 groups, which I know my doubles. I could figure out my 5s and put those together, that they have a pathway to figure it out. And then lastly, we ask them what they do when they get stuck when they're working on math. But that piece is providing us that valuable element of not just the math that they know and their strategies and efficiency, but also what is their disposition. So I don't think she'd have any problem with us when you have a student, you're talking with them and interviewing them already, they're sitting there with you, asking them another question or two of that you want to get a feeling on your kids of their beliefs. I actually had the privilege last week at the Building Thinking Classrooms conference. We were in Phoenix, many of us were there last week. But Amy Chang presented on street data, Norma, and the study that she did in their school, where they asked all these students in a certain classroom 2 questions, and it was, who do you think should be speaking the most in math class? And also, what makes you feel comfortable sharing your math thinking with others? And just getting that sense of that extra element of information of data, and then being able to analyze that data. And they shared the data from March. They had given it first in the fall and then again in March. And to see that growth over at the beginning of the year, the students were thinking that the teacher should share. They'd be one talking all the time because they're the ones teaching us. But then by the part of March comes along, the kids were saying that we need to be sharing our thinking. We need to be learning from each other. And so it was just really a fabulous well-roundedness. And it reminded me of these empathy interviews that Rachel talks about, of finding out these dispositions of our kids as well, so that we're not assuming things and asking them to self-reflect on themselves. And it right to me, that's building their agency, that they have a responsibility on this journey of learning math. It's not all us deciding things for them, but including the kids on that journey and empowering them. I think of like math fluency, the math running record. When we find out what set of facts they're working on, I want kids to come to me and say, okay, I'm ready to test out of this. I'm ready to move on, as opposed to me as a teacher keeping a checklist, who is where, like empowering the kids. This is your journey that I'm helping provide opportunity to build. So I love that. I love those.
Yeah, and I was sharing in the group, I had a district do student empathy interviews based on that template, which don't use all the questions. You have to decide and prioritize. 2 is great.
Yeah.
But one of the questions, and it's also in the book on page 99, is what are you most proud of? And in certain classrooms, it was getting 100 or getting all my I ready done and all of this. And here they were thinking that the students were excited about math, but they were proud of their scores and their grades and what subtle messaging was happening in the classroom unintentionally. These teachers all, wanted the students to learn, but when it came directly from the students, that's what they thought was valued. It was very self-reflective for the teachers.
Absolutely.
I also shared in my group. I teach first
Oh,
grade. So
sorry.
I shared how at the beginning and the end of the year in my thinking classroom, I give my kids just basically a blank sheet of paper. And I say, draw a picture of what it looks like to do math in our room. And there is one little prompt at the bottom that says math is blank. And so they do it in the fall, they do it in the spring, and their pictures tell a story. And they tell a story of what their journey, right? The journey they've been on, their math identity, what it looks like at the end compared to the beginning. It's quite inspiring. So I enjoy doing that with my kids too.
Thank you for sharing that, Tammy. I've put in the slide deck for us a link to a YouTube video by Mike Flynn that's entitled Redefining What It Means to Be Good at Math. And he talks about the concrete pictorial abstract as being islands that we're building bridges between the islands. It's not first you're here and then you're here, as if being on abstract island is the end all and be all. It's about connecting bridges between all of them and having all kids develop all representations and their understanding. So I love that video. So I put that in that slide deck for all of us as well. Any last thoughts about? I love it, Karina. Yeah, the bridge builders is true. Any other last comments about chapter 6 before we go on to the core instruction, chapter 7? Welcome back, everyone. Curious your discussions that you had on this 7th chapter on the investing in core ideas. And a lot was mentioned about counting collections. So I'm curious what your discussions were surrounding that.
One of the bulk things that came up in our group was how the value of counting collections, but the challenge of doing it in many classrooms when teachers feel like they have to follow a curriculum or a program and they can't fit that. They can't get through all the 180 lessons that they're supposed to get through in a year. And they go, how can I do something like counting collections when I can't get through what I'm supposed to get through?
Mm. I'm curious about that in terms of, there's one thing about us telling lessons to kids and expecting them to mimic things back. But in my mind, if we invest the time of accounting collection, some of those lessons are going to go like this because they understand place value, right? Are we giving them the opportunities to truly understand the mathematics by engaging them in these activities that build their conception of the core idea? Or are we too, not of anyone's fault, a lot of administration pressure and all of getting through pacing things, but I just feel like, and Christina Tondeville says this too, that if can we just slow down, we can go faster later. If we just do these foundational things well, we can connect it to the other things in the future. And place value is such a foundational idea. So many upper elementary teachers tell me that the kids have no place value understanding or number sense. And we look back to the early years, and was there time spent or was the algorithm done in grade 1 to add and subtract, let's say, right? It's like, oh, they haven't had time to develop their understanding of multi-digit numbers with the place values attached. And, but yeah, it's such a hard balance for sure.
I think one of our first grade teachers, I don't know if she did this year, but it was one of the years in the past. I remember she said she really liked, now it wasn't the kids doing all of it, so she was kind of doing it, but it was still, she felt that it really helped her kids with place value. She did it during calendar time and, basically counting the days, as they went along, and they would see, when they got to 10, that moved over in her cups, and she did it as you would do, I don't know which way it's looking to you, hundreds, tens and ones, hundreds,
Right.
tens and ones. And so, that was at least better than just saying, here's the tens place, here's the hundreds place. I did thoroughly enjoy that part about the counting collections and including that in with place value.
Absolutely. Any other takeaways?
Yeah, we spend a little bit of time talking about how what to do or how much support to give for students who, like in the lower grades, who don't organize their work independently, right? Because that's like when you count collections and you start counting in the higher, over 50, and definitely you need to have a better organization. And we all notice that many kids, when you first start doing this, many kids don't really know how to organize their stuff. And then whether you help them, or you give them some hints, or you just kind of let them figure it out, or watch some of their peers count their collections. There's lots of learning going on. It's also part of the executive functioning that is so important.
Yeah. I love Rachel's phrasing about the guided inquiry, right? That it's not just a free-for-all of them just going crazy kind of, but it's a guided, there's so much intention behind it, of our prompting of our questions. And yeah, I think that's such an important, crucial piece to that, to get to know our kids and what supports they will need, and to ask them, what do you need, as well. Any other thoughts from anyone?
Annalise, I would just say that I think a common thread through this whole book is just how much of this is an equity issue. And this is not as you were saying, there's so much pressure with these, curriculums that have so many days planned out, and pacing and state testing and everything that teachers have to do. But when we don't focus on these core ideas for our students, no matter where they're entering and how much support they need, just giving them what they need to try to get to some level of confidence with them, it's really like an equity, because math is so vertical, right? It's so, the way it's structured. Every time a student is not meeting that benchmark, they're just getting at more and more of a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. So true. And this is certainly opening my eyes to the special need populations, to the disabilities of, making sure we're trusting in their ability to think, and we're not over scaffolding. We're not doing that just in case kind of supports, but doing the just in time, they're getting to know them as thinkers and learners. And, in my consulting work, a lot of times special educators aren't included in my trainings. I'll ask, are special included educators here today? And like, oh, no, they couldn't join in. They had a different thing to do. And I want to be more proactive in asking, can we please have everyone at the table? We are all a team meeting the needs of all of these kids, because it's not in us and them. It's not that these brains learn differently than these, right? It's what's best for all kids, and to include everyone in that community, for sure. I wanted to just share with you, I'm not sure if any of you have never seen Counting Collections, but it is based on a book by, but right here, Megan Franke and Elam Kazemi, Angela Chantaro. And it's a book for pre-K to 5. It is not for early elementary only for Counting Collections. And I want to show you examples of both. So I was working with some kindergartners, and I had them once a week for a half an hour for about 6 to 7 weeks. And so when we started, I just gave them a bunch of beads, and I said, I want you to organize them. And ask you whatever materials that you want to be able to organize them. But I want you to be able to tell me how many are there. And because they had begun counting one by one, but when they were done, I would say, how do you prove it? And the only way they had to prove it was to count one by one. So I wanted, I said, I wonder if there's a way that you might organize them that could help us figure out how many are there and whatnot. And they did begin first pairing them together. And I would give them more and more each week to kind of push them a little bit too. So they did naturally do in pairs, and then by groups of 5. And I would tell them, I can subitize 5. My brain can tell that that's 5. Because once they got to doing 10s, then I was like, well, now I'm out. I can't tell that that's 10. I have to count them, and I don't want to count. I'm always being mindful of trying to help move the students from counting into additive reasoning. So I would say, these are 10. I can't tell that there's 10. There could be 9 in one, 11 in another. And so I'm just curious, can you think of anything that might be able to help us out a bit? And then they begin, and again, I did not say to them, I want you to put them in 10 frames, right? It's a bit of that constructive of one kid can think of it and then others can say, oh, that's a great idea. But putting them in 10 frames, bam, I can tell that's 10. I don't have to count, right? And then they asked me one week to bring mini 10 frames. So I always brought the next week. They asked me for like plates and Dixie cups and things. And so I put these 10 frames because they began filling the 10 frame and then dumping it into a Dixie cup. So we knew there was 10 in that cup. No one counted it out one by one to make any kind of mistake, right? But I had given them so many beads now that the whole table was full of Dixie cups. So now they had to organize the Dixie cups, and they put pairs of 2s to make 20. They did like a 5-dot frame, like a dice, that was 50, and so on. But then one kid thought about putting those cups in a 10 frame. This just gives you the chills. It's like, holy cow, like, right? So you're looking at 316 beads, and we don't have to count a thing. They already were put in a structure of a 10 frame to get it into the cup. Now we've got 10 tens, which is the 100, which is in Rachel's chapter showing those embedded cups, right? Like in a 100, there are 10 tens. So they're getting that physical sense of what the number is. I saw Graham Fletcher. He came to New Hampshire this past March for our Dine and Discuss. And he was talking about kids are being asked to calculate with numbers that they have no conception of. They haven't seen a collection of 412 to know that minus 291, like what is that 291? So to give this experience of counting collections where they're seeing the quantities of these larger numbers, but you're also embedded within that the structure of our base 10 number system of place value. It's incredibly powerful. And part of that is they then also do on paper pictorially represent what they did concretely. So we're connecting those in that way. And I'm going to share Kathy's story. Or Kathy, do you want to share the story? Is Kathy still here? Yes, Kathy, you sharing. This is your story.
So I had gotten some cards from a local casino because they go through their cards constantly and throw them out. So I got all these boxes of cards donated to our school so the kids could play games with them. And basically it was February vacation and
Yes.
like the day before February vacation. And literally the boxes had shown up and the kids were like, let's figure out how many cards are in there. And I was like, how are we going to do that? And one little girl said, well, there's 60, what did she say, 62 or 64 cards, because she knew her brother had like thrown them at her in the past and was like, oh, it's 62 pickup or whatever it is. So they figured out how many were in a case, and then they multiplied that by the 6 cases we had on the floor, and then they rounded up. They never used a calculator, and they're only in 3rd grade. They rounded the numbers up because they were like, oh, well, we know I think it came out, I
It
can't
was
remember.
898 times 52.
Yeah, I couldn't
Yeah.
remember the exact numbers. And they rounded it, and they knew like, oh, well, if I just add 2 more groups, I can take them away at the end. And they were able to figure out how many cards were in all of those cases of cards. And that they were so engaged the entire time. There's all the tables, so they counted all the decks of cards that there were. And then they multiplied them all out. And that was basically the day before vacation, where most of us kind of give up and just put videos on, which was my lesson plan for the day until the card showed up. And then they were like, let's figure this out. And they were so engaged the entire time. And it was just amazing to watch 3rd graders be able to solve that without a calculator.
I just absolutely love that story because, right, they're 3rd graders in February. And
Yeah.
to have organized them in those same piles of 10s I just showed you with the beads, but now we have equal groups, right? That's when you work in grade 3 to 5, the counting collections is finding how many there are in a equal group collection of objects. I have 12 boxes of markers, but each box of marker has 4 markers in it, right? So you're doing the multiplication of the equal groups. So if I have them working on their 10 decks of cards and then putting that in a 10 frame to figure out there are 898 decks, and then how many cards is that? I mean, I would have imagined a student saying, we're 3rd graders. We can't do 3-digit by 2-digit. But the fact that none of them did, because their disposition was built all year in Kathy's room, that we can figure things out. The sky is limitless, right? When you think about that disposition of the kids. I just absolutely love that. And I just love that 900 groups of 52 and then taking away 2 52s, right? It's so different than this times this and this times this and plunk a 0 down there. I think that counting collections it has the magic to it. That and also the choral counting, the other half of the book. But I highly recommend that book. And I do, as much as I know pacing guides and whatnot get us in our core, like the magic in that of the mathematics of understanding it. I don't think you can beat that. And the more our kids can think and reason and understand that, the more they'll do okay at the other core content that we're doing.